This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War podcast. I am Finbarr Bermingham from the Political Economy Desk here at the South China Morning Post. We're still trying to get a handle on the coronavirus impact on trade and supply chains. And today I've got three very capable guests to give us the latest update. John Carter and Joe Shin, our political economy editors here, will discuss the very bleak outlook for global trade that came out of the World Trade Organization this week. We've also had more relatively bad data on China's economy, and we'll quickly delve into what Michael Jordan's Chinese name can tell us about US-China relations. After that, I'm joined by Professor Heiwai Tang, a professor of economics and associate director at the Institute for China and Global Development at the University of Hong Kong. We're going to discuss what he considers to be one of the more unfortunate economic legacies of coronavirus, more inequality, and another hammer blow to the high street as we see it. A lot to get through today, so let's get on with the show. Delighted to be joined again by political economy editors John Carter and Joe Shin to discuss some of the big news stories of the week. John, we'll start with you. We've had a couple more releases this week, which we covered at SEMP, showing the potential impact on the economy, both China and global, of the coronavirus and the containment efforts. First of all, we had the World Trade Organization, which updated its trade forecast for 2020. In the worst case scenario, they're looking at a 32% collapse in global trade, largely because of the coronavirus. We also this morning had inflation numbers out of China, monthly numbers these, but they also give us some idea how the Chinese economy is coping and recovering. John, give us an idea of what that says and what's the general economic picture looking like at this point?
Well, as we've talked about before, the big issue is what the outlook for global trade is. First, we had a supply shock when China shut down for basically the whole month of February, and so didn't produce the things that most global supply chains depend on. And now we have the potential for a global demand shock because of the spread of the virus in Europe and the US. People aren't spending. They're staying at home. They're not going out to the stores. They're not spending anything that they don't need to spend on, in part because a lot of them are losing their jobs. You've seen it in the last 3 weeks. More than 17 million Americans went on unemployment, which is a huge number for America. So you have the combination of those two things, a supply shock and a demand shock, depressing global trade, and the WTO numbers reflect that. The question is, how soon will this lift? It depends entirely on the progress of efforts to contain the virus. In the US, you see President Trump pushing very hard to get business to resume, but at the same time, you have strong efforts to contain that virus because the US has become the epicenter of the virus in the world. Mm-hmm. So there's a conflict there, there's a natural conflict, and it will resolve itself over time, but no one at this point knows how long that will be. And in your own reporting, Finbarr, you found that nobody wants to make a prediction about what the outlook for Chinese exports is, and that is because it's just too uncertain. Nobody knows.
Yeah, my own reporting or lack thereof, I was trying to find out, based on the World Trade Organization report, what was the actual forecast for China, and nobody's prepared to put a figure on it at this point. I think Louis from Oxford Economics said -12, but he had a number of caveats. he didn't want to be held too firmly to that. So it's a difficult time for forecasters just because of the moving nature of the picture. And John, just on the inflation numbers, what did they say about the Chinese economy this morning?
Well, first, consumer prices decelerated significantly, in part because of the downward pressure on food prices, resulting in part from the pandemic, in part from the end of the Chinese New Year period, when prices tend to go up as Chinese banquet and spend a lot of money on food with their families. But again, the pandemic is putting downward pressure on demand, which reduces prices. That's on the consumer side. On the producer side, on the manufacturer's side, prices are declining. In other words, manufacturers selling to wholesalers are having to discount their goods in order to sell them to wholesalers. And again, this is an impact from the virus and lack of demand for those goods. So it just underscores that the Chinese economy is still struggling.
Sure, absolutely. And Zhou Xin, what are they doing about this? What's happening in Beijing and what has happened this week that tells us how China's trying to, I mean, they've obviously been trying to reopen the economy, but has there been anything over the course of the last few days which gives us an idea of what they're doing?
Thank you, Finbarr. And as you and John just mentioned, this uncertainty about the exports is also shared by those policymakers in Beijing, as we can see from the official statements from the Chinese government this week, is that they are increasingly worried about the uncertainty and the risks in the outside world. And more importantly, for the first time, and I think the Chinese top leadership, led by President Xi Jinping, has made it clear that China has to prepare for a quite long period of time of outside world that's increasingly uncertain and even hostile, not as friendly as before. So this has been kind of been worrying for some Chinese watchers as well, because one guy commented on Chinese social media. He said, the last time I saw the phrase quite a long period of time is from Deng Xiaoping's book describing China's primary stage of socialism, which is likely to last for 100 years. So it's very interesting. Yeah. And also, as for the as it's kind of agreed in Beijing now that China cannot rely on exports to driving the Chinese economy, so more focus now is turning to the domestic side. More domestic reforms, and local governments are issuing consumption coupons. Whether these are effective or not is another issue, but at least you can see that the central government is giving money to local governments to start projects, allowing them to selling more bonds than usual, and local governments trying to give a little bit of incentive to the local consumers. So we can see the shift from kind of trying to restart the economy by opening up the country to the outside world, to more of like we will remain closed for quite a long period of time, but at the same time we will try to keep the economy running. As you may know, Finbarr, the situation is very in terms of connecting to the outside world. China is actually closing itself up. Three roads to Russia were closed this week. And for Beijing, obviously, the government has made it very, very clear that they don't want anybody, flying directly from outside China. They want them to go to the neighboring airports before they get into Beijing. And in Guangdong, I think they have tightened this regulation as well. And the hostility towards, for instance, the local African community there has increased, because people's mistrust and the concerns about the imported risks of coronavirus has increased.
Yeah, I saw there was a number of Nigerian people who got diagnosed this week, and I think that's where that sort of stigma and backlash came. What we've seen this week as well is, as you know, a great song and dance, the huge light show as Wuhan reopened and people were allowed to leave the city for the first time since January. A real milestone, I suppose, in China's recovery. But on the same day, the Canton Fair was cancelled. It was China's biggest import-export show, huge, iconic symbol of China's trade economy, and it's happening online because they want to continue to contain the virus. I think what that shows us is that there's a real, it's not as uniform an opening up picture as perhaps people may think who don't look at China too closely. I mean, as Zhou Xin said, they've closed the borders with Russia. They've stopped international flights. Last week, they closed a lot of the cinemas that they'd reopened in China. They closed a lot of the tourist attractions. So I think it's worth, John or Zhou Xin, whoever wants to come in on this, we're seeing a real sort of patchwork recovery here, aren't we? It's not as simple as everything reopening and everything back to normal straight away.
No, I think that's right. And again, it's the contradiction between the need to contain the virus, which requires you to keep social distance and to close businesses where that's not possible, against the need to keep the economy going, because if you let the economy go too far down, it will be very difficult to recover. And then in China in particular, you'll have a very large unemployment problem, which could lead to social instability. So yes, it's very much a patchwork process at the moment, with the government balancing virus containment with its strong desire to get the economy moving again.
I agree with John. I think this is basically the dilemma China is in. And one trend we can see from this, how Beijing is, balancing between the two objectives, is that it's increasingly tilting towards the domestic market. The reopening of Wuhan is an important sign that China is feeling more comfortable, having a kind of nationwide cross-province activities. But at the same time, the Canton Fair, which has been going on in China since the 1950s, and it didn't even stop during the SARS outbreak in 2003, is now completely cancelled offline and completely go online, say a lot of things about Beijing's worry about the imported risks.
Not out of the woods yet, I think, is the message there. Being the US-China trade war podcast, I guess we should talk about the US-China trade deal, which many of us may have forgotten about, but was only signed about 3 months ago, January 15th. It came into force on February 15th, and within 30 working days of that, China was supposed to have published its intellectual property action plan. Now, those days have passed. China has still not delivered the action plan. As I understand, there's been a bit of frustration on the US side because China could have asked for an extension, and my sources have told me that this would have probably been fine, but China is arguing that because of the lockdown, 30 working days haven't passed, and it's a really sort of it seems to me quite a petty argument over the actual definition of 30 working days. But regardless of that, we saw recently in China, and we reported on this week, Jushin, a live case of China's intellectual property regime and how sometimes it can rub American companies up the wrong way. Give us a quick lowdown on that one, Jushin.
Okay, this is a very famous case that's been going on for years. It's between a Chinese showmaker and Michael Jordan. Basically, this Chinese showmaker used the image and the Chinese name of Michael Jordan, Qiaodan, as its brand. And of course, Michael Jordan's company sued this Chinese showmaker, using the name and the image without authorization. But this lawsuit has going on for years. And now finally, the top Chinese court has ruled some of the pronunciations, the Chinese name of Michael Jordan cannot be used by this shoe company. But the images are still okay. And this actually say a lot of things about China's development of intellectual property rights protection. When this shoe company was firstly established, I think in 1990s, Michael Jordan was hot, and nobody basically paid attention to China's IPR situation. And so this is a brilliant idea, using a famous existing NBA star, every basketball player in Chinese high schools admire. So use this as a brand and use it as a selling point. When I was, in 1997, I first saw this kind of image. I automatically think like, oh, this must be officially affiliated by Michael Jordan, which isn't the case. Anyway, and still this has been going on for years because under Chinese intellectual property law, this company has to do all the paperwork, it has registered, and it's proved that it has rights over the Chinese name of Michael Jordan and the image of Michael Jordan. So it's very, very, very interesting thing. And I think it's in last month, finally, the Chinese top courts ruled some of these violations are just too obvious. You can't use them. So the people in China are actually really support the top court decision. This is goes too far. It's too obvious. Why don't just just to completely ban the image and the pronunciation of Michael Jordan? So it's very interesting, but it is seen as a small progress, a small step forward in China's intellectual property rights protection. And of course, we are expecting to see more, as intellectual property rights protection is possibly the biggest part of the US-China trade deal.
Yeah, cornerstone of the agreement. John, I know you're not a Chicago Bulls man, but do you want to weigh in on that?
other than to say that Michael Jordan is an icon in America. He's considered one of the best basketball players ever. And given the popularity of the NBA in China, this case resonates. So it's a very important case in that regard. It sends a signal, perhaps not the entire signal that the United States would like it to send, but that's the whole process here of the United States wanting stricter IP enforcement in China.
Really interesting stuff. You really slam dunked that one. Thank you, guys. Hang on, we can cut that, right?
That was a layup, yes.
Really quickly before we go, John Carter, next week, the moment we've been waiting for quarterly data on the Chinese economy. What are you expecting there?
Well, what we're expecting a week from today, so the 17th, is first quarter GDP, which is expected to show the first contraction in the Chinese economy since 1976, so 44 years ago. That's a long time. And this is expected to be the only quarter of contraction. The Chinese economy is expected to rebound somewhat in the second quarter. The issue is how much, and we don't know yet. We don't have any data for April yet. So we'll see. Also included in that data release next Friday will be March data on industrial production and retail sales and investment, all of which will, again, give us clues about how much the Chinese economy rebounded after the very weak February when basically the whole country's economy was shut down.
Yeah, I think that the point to remember that I'm thinking is for March is almost like a window. It's the window post-shutdown, pre-demand slump, right? So I feel like people are going to look at this data and it may be really good, but it doesn't really, the long-term ramifications maybe aren't captured perhaps in the March data.
Right, and as we saw in the PMI data, which is sentiment data, there was a strong rebound in March because it couldn't possibly have been worse than February. Yeah. It doesn't underline or doesn't speak to what the underlying economy is doing. Also, next week, we have trade data for March. And again, we expect an improvement in Chinese exports from, again, the very dismal February outcome of a decline of 17%. Having said that, it will. Analysts expect exports to continue to decline, but we'll see. And going back to the issue of foreign demand, there were orders in place in January and early February before the Chinese New Year. Those orders are being filled now, and so the export data may reflect some of that, a decent improvement in exports. The issue is, what's the demand going to be like in April, May, and June? We don't know yet, but the early signs suggest it could be quite weak.
Absolutely. It's not looking good. We will look forward to discussing that again next week. John Carter, Joe Sin, thank you so much and have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.
We're now going to go straight into an interview I did on Friday morning with Heiwai Tang, who is a professor of economics at the University of Hong Kong. This follows on from a couple of previous episodes we had on the podcast, where we try and throw things forward a little bit and look at what might be the unfortunate legacies of coronavirus. Last week, you may recall, we had Frank Lavin, who was a White House aide to Ronald Reagan, very seasoned US diplomat, discussing how this might affect Donald Trump's chances of re-election and the general trend around US-China relations. The week before that, we had trade economist David Dodwell on the show to discuss how he views the coronavirus changing supply chains and industries, picking some real winners and losers. This week, Professor Tang is building on a column that he wrote in the SCMP this week, looking at some of the historical events that we had over the past 100 years, the Spanish flu, the global financial crisis, and basically what they did for the economy, which was create more inequality, hollow out the high street. And I'm afraid that it's pretty ominous because he thinks that he can see the same things happening in society today. We're going to go straight into this interview now. Enjoy. Heiwai Tang is a professor of economics and associate director of the Institute for China and Global Development at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Tang, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. An article you wrote for the SCMP this week painted a really quite a bleak picture of our post-coronavirus future, which before reading the article I had been very much looking forward to. But this sort of gave me a bit of a reality check as to how difficult things are going to be. The headline of the piece for those listening is "Coronavirus Could Leave the World an Even More Unequal Place." But what grabbed me was this sort of dystopian vision that you put across of what we consider to be the sort of the high street, you know. In a few months, and I'm quoting here, in a few months, when we finally feel safe and free to walk around our neighbourhoods, we may find that the small coffee shop owned by the young latte art champion or the kebab restaurant run by the refugee family no longer exists. Instead, in the nearby shopping mall that is once again packed with tourists, the global fast food chains may all have expanded. And I recall living in London, Heiwai, 10 years ago when this post-financial crisis landscape actually, it really makes me think back to that, because on the streets, the high streets of London, all the sort of boutique and local shops were replaced by chicken shops and betting shops. And I sort of get the impression that that's what you sort of reckon is going to happen after this as well, that we're going to see a real shake-up. Let us know what has sort of driven you to have that vision of the post-coronavirus landscape that you've written about in that article.
I mean, the idea behind this article is really based on my personal experience. So the quote that you just read is really about my daily life. I would go down to an area near my university to get my afternoon latte. And it is true that, the owner of the shop won multiple latte art competitions around the world. And in the last 2 months, I haven't seen the shop open again. I'm not sure whether it went bankrupt or just that, because of a slow business, the owner decided to take a break. And then, I read this piece in New York Times interviewing David Chang, the Asian American chef who owned Momofuku and won multiple Michelin stars. Obviously a very successful chef in the US. And then he talked about the survival of his own restaurants. He owned 8 restaurants in Manhattan, and also the survival of the entire restaurant industry in the US. And then I realized this is not a specific problem for Hong Kong or major cities. This is a problem for all the small and medium businesses. Obviously, the hardest hit industries right now are restaurants and tourism because of social distancing and essentially travel shutdowns. All the cities were basically in a zombie mode. Growing up in Hong Kong, I'm used to sort of dining out in small restaurants, and in the last 20 years, I can say I started missing a lot of them because many of them just couldn't afford the very expensive rent. Mm-hmm. So what happened right now in major cities around the world is sort of expensive rent driving up businesses in fast motion, right? So we are talking about in a matter of 2 or 3 months, many of the small businesses will not be able to survive. And if they leave the industry forever, it's very hard for them to come back. And then we're going to see basically multinationals, global brands are going to expand crazy when the rents go down, because these are the capitalized, cash-rich companies which can still afford to pay the high rent or even negotiate with the landlords to lower the rent. So I'm with you, right? You have seen what happened in London right after the great financial crisis. I think, in a few months, when we are finally out from the current tragedy, we will realize that the business, the situation on the street is going to look very similar to what we have seen in the last 20 years in Hong Kong, but now it took only 2 or 3 months to turn it into that direction.
Yeah, for Hong Kong, I wonder whether the situation is particularly acute, given that all of last year, not all of last year, but for about 6 months of last year, we had the protest movement. A lot of businesses were already shutting down, and I wonder even whether those multinational companies will even take the plunge to set up their restaurant chains in Hong Kong, given the sort of downturn, given the the potential for the protest movement to return as well. So it's almost like a double whammy there for restaurateurs and shopkeepers in Hong Kong.
Yeah, Hong Kong is particularly in a recession mode. Not only that, we have this short-term coronavirus recession, but there's a medium-term problem which started last year due to the social movement. And I would say, based on past pandemics, like the Spanish flu in 1918, and also based on what has happened in China in the last few months, we should remain slightly optimistic about the recovery. I think the coronavirus will be over. The recovery is going to be strong. But the problem is, we're going to see more countries getting into the coronavirus gradually, right? Southern Hemisphere has not been exposed to it so much, partly because it was in summertime, and there have been research showing that this virus is going to spread more rapidly in cold environment. So we're going to get out from it, but after we're out from it, we may see increased inequality across businesses, across people as well, because of all sort of central bank quantitative easing, which is going to boost equity market, stock market, housing market prices.
Yeah, and this is another very important point. Inequality, you have said, will rise on the back of this. You sort of drew comparisons with the global financial crisis, with the post-Spanish flu era almost 100 years ago. That idea of trickle-down economics, that quantitative easing was supposed to deliver post-financial crisis, never really happened, did it? It surprises me to see, that it's almost still considered a very valuable tool in the armories of central bankers.
Yeah, so this crisis is very different from almost all the recent economic crises that we have seen. We are talking about a complete economic shutdowns in almost all economies in the world. And the right policy reaction, I think, should be obviously protecting lives, providing social security to make sure that those who suffer from the coronavirus, either economically or socially, will be protected. And now we started seeing central banks around the world pumping money into the financial market, which is kind of frustrating from my side, because I understand in 2008, 2009, the economic crisis started with a financial crisis, and therefore providing liquidity and making sure that the economy is going is important. But this time it's more like a supply side shutdown crisis, right? You're talking about companies and factories that are open with limited capacity, or either with no capacity, and providing more liquidity may not be enough to essentially solve the supply side problem. And the side effect is, we're going to see exactly what has happened after 2009, a skyrocketing increase in stock and housing prices. If we look at the Dow Jones stock price index, it went up by 3.7. It is now 3.7 times at the peak compared to the trough in 2008, right? So imagine you have $1 million US, and then luckily you didn't lose all of them during the financial crisis. You put it in the stock market just to buy Dow Jones index, and now it will be 3.7 million US dollars. Mm-hmm. So I would say, in this coronavirus, obviously everyone lose income and opportunities, but those who have accumulated so much wealth in the last 12 years since the previous crisis would probably be okay, and they are going to wait for the opportunity to get in to the stock market again. Thanks to the quantitative easing, I'm expecting that the stock market is going to boom much more than before, and we have already seen the rallies in the last 2 weeks that the Dow Jones has increased by over 12% this week.
Something that you said there just really resonated. Last night I was sitting on the couch and I got two alerts on my phone, one from the Wall Street Journal, one from the Financial Times. One was about the US employment numbers, something like 6-point-something million people registered for unemployed over the course of the last week. The second was about the Dow Jones rally. I just thought it was a sort of a snapshot of what you've just said, that on one hand you have millions of people in America losing their jobs, and on the other hand the stock markets are rallying. It's almost like a dichotomy there that on the face of it shouldn't be happening, but it sort of sums up what you've just said, I think, to an extent.
Exactly. You put it in a very good way. There's a big detachment between the financial market and the real economy. And we have seen that in the recovery process from the great financial crisis. The stock market rallied for over 10 years. It took the US and most of the European countries almost a decade to go back to essentially the pre-crisis economic level. And I still remember, about 10 years ago when I was in the US, people were talking about the so-called jobless growth. You see GDP numbers going up, you see stock market prices skyrocketing, but you don't see solid job growth, right? So this is going back to my earlier points that the quantitative easing pushed the financial market up, benefits those who own assets, but somehow those who got benefits did not spend the money in the local economies, and somehow there's no trickling down process.
Yeah. So the little guy is the person who loses. Once again, you've mentioned that this will lead to rising inequality. Unfortunately, that's your baseline forecast. Do you think that's a global phenomenon? And obviously, we're talking about the U.S. stock market, the Dow Jones. We're talking about U.S. employment. What about China here? Because I think a lot of people perhaps don't realize that there are huge inequality issues in China, as there are well documented in the West, the US, Europe, and so on. China also has inequality issues. Do you think that is a danger that this may be also sharpened by the coronavirus and the sort of economic fallout from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would like to point you to a wonderful research paper by Thomas Piketty, who is the French economist, the author of the famous book Capital in the 21st Century. So recently he had a research article published in American Economic Review with several co-authors. And he documented that the increase in income and wealth inequality in China is actually comparable to the increases in the US. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you look at the top 10% income earners in China, they have 40% of the entire income in China. And if we look at the same number, the top 10% Americans, and they have 45% of US incomes. So obviously a lot of these incomes are capital incomes, not only labor incomes. But it is kind of surprising to notice that in China, the top 10% is like the top 10% in the US, right? So, the article even argued that in the past, China looked more like Scandinavian and continental European countries. And now China actually looks very similar to the US. In terms of wealth inequality, if you look at the top 1%, in the US, those top 1% had 70% of wealth. In China, the top 1% have 65% of Chinese wealth. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this wealth are, money in the stock market and also in the housing market. So the rapid increase in wealth and income inequality in China was partly driven by the fiscal stimulus coming from the central government right after the financial crisis. We're still talking about today among our colleagues, the 4 trillion yuan fiscal stimulus, who went to the hands first to state-owned banks, and then to local governments, and then to politically connected people and politically connected firms. So those are people who probably benefited a lot from the essentially cash handouts from the top.
Just to finish up, Heiwai, the post-coronavirus landscape, it looks a bit miserable. I think we're all expecting economic hardship. And it's happening at a time when there's a real sharpening of political rhetoric as well. As someone who's worked for many years in the US, who is a Hong Konger and who has studied Chinese economy, what's your assessment of the future political relationship between the US and China? Do you see this deteriorating beyond repair? Do you think that the economic conditions which you've laid out here are almost like a breeding ground for, if not conflict, then certainly a sustained period of intense rivalry between the two global superpowers?
So I think the US and China relationships have been deteriorating for at least 2 years. And my conjecture has been that it will continue to deteriorate in the next few years. So the coronavirus obviously is not going to help to improve the situation. How much it is going to worsen it is still an open question. But the early signs did not suggest that coronavirus is going to help. You already see President Trump in the US started to blame China for the virus itself. And there have been a lot of finger pointings from both sides. The US and other Western countries have been blaming the WHO for not alerting other countries about the upcoming of the virus. And there are even some accusations of the WHO about colluding with China to sort of hide some of the information related to the spread of the infections. So I think the entire situation has made the world more political. Countries will obviously use this pandemic as an excuse to postpone any policies or reforms that are much needed for the domestic problems. Here in Hong Kong, we see a similar situation, right? The social movement were sort of slowed down in the end of last year, and then was totally basically resolved temporarily by the coronavirus. And I'm expecting that, after the pandemic is over, the unresolved social movement is going to come back again. So in some sense, you can imagine the US is going to have the same situation, right? So it's going to be a very bad recession for the US and other advanced economies. The leaders in those countries are not going to take the blames for mishandling of the situation, and they're going to point fingers to other countries, in particular China, and trying to divert the attention away from the domestic issues to China. And now we are expecting, a very difficult time for the US, and they're going to have the presidential election in November. And Trump obviously is not going to let this sort of anti-China sentiment to go away, because if anything, it is going to help him to get reelected again. So in the short run, I would say the tension is not going to be away between the two superpowers. In the medium run, I would say with the weakened economies in both China and the US, both countries may be more willing to talk about potential trade deals, right? Because the trade war is not going to help. It's going to worsen the declining economies in both countries. But then in the long run, maybe they're just going to shift away from the trade war to other kind of Cold War tactics, maybe wars on technology, or, more exclusion on knowledge or technology exchanges. I mean, just to be upfront, right? We are already in a Cold War for quite a while, and the Cold War is not going to go away.
Professor, that's been very, very interesting. Thank you so much for giving us your insights there. I hope that we're wrong, but I can't help but think that you're probably right. It's been really interesting to get your thoughts. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this week's US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbarr Bermingham. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using it. Please take a moment to check out a couple of the other podcasts in the South China Morning Post stable. Inside China looks at broader issues around Greater China. This week's latest edition looks at what Hong Kong can teach the rest of the world about its own experiences of the pandemic. The latest edition of Inside China Tech looks at how education and e-learning is changing China as a result of all this isolation. Keep up to date with all the latest developments on the coronavirus and everything else around Greater China, SAMP.com. You can follow us on Twitter at SAMP Economy. I'm at F Birmingham, that's Birmingham with the B-E-R, not like the city. Please wash your hands, please keep your social distance, and we'll see you again next week.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.